Give me some perspective on this. Obviously, there are a lot of Americans who believe that what Donald Trump, as it related to the election, is the most serious thing, and they would like to see him held accountable for that before the next election. But all of these cases, the drip, drip, drip of being Donald Trump found liable or responsible by judges and juries does whittle away at him, at least in some circles.
Well, the bottom is falling out on his legal cases because there are actual standards of evidence and proof in civil court and in criminal court. And conversely, his attempt to equate his situation with Joe Biden's situation by concocting a whole bunch of conspiracy theories has also pretty much collapsed. This last week, the Alexander Smirnov, who was the confidential human informant at the base of the Burisma allegations, was accused of being a fraud who had lied to the FBI and constructed a false documentary record by Donald Trump's own handpicked special counsel, Mr. Weiss, who's brought criminal charges against Smirnov. So the whole impeachment investigation against Joe Biden appears to be vanquished at this point. At least that's the way that I see it. And so what you've got is Biden campaigning on real public policy promises and commitments. And then you've got Trump, who's in this constant soap opera related to various financial frauds, political frauds, sexual attacks. And if I have my way, we will also be talking about the millions and millions of dollars that he and his family have been taking from foreign governments against the Constitution.
Yes, I think we must be talking about that. Let's just go back for a second to what you just talked about, Burisma and Ukraine. This thing is like a cockroach in a New York apartment. It doesn't go away no matter how much evidence you have that it's not really a thing. You serve on the Oversight and Accountability Committee alongside your Republican colleague, James Comer, who's the chair of that committee and one of the members who are leading the impeachment inquiry into President Biden. And as you mentioned last week, the key FBI informant in that case was indicted for lying to the government about information that Republicans, that's central to the Republican case in their impeachment inquiry. What do you make of this? You're a lawyer and a member of Congress. What do you make about, do Republicans just not vet this information? And why does it stay alive despite proof and evidence that continually comes out that there is no story here?
Well, there have been nearly a dozen refutations of these Burisma claims, including by the former head of Burisma, including by Rudy Giuliani's right-hand man, Lev Parnas, who wrote Chairman Comer and me as the ranking Democrat a long letter saying this is all based on a house of cards, fraudulent allegations. It's time to let it go. Even the Republicans in the Senate investigated in 2020 and came back empty-handed, saying that there was nothing there. And now we know why. We've gotten to the very bottom of the allegations, and Smirnov has been proven to be a fraud. And so, I would hope that the Republicans would let it go, but that would suggest that they have some other program or public agenda, and it looks like they don't. I mean, if I were chairing the Oversight Committee right now, we would be having serious oversight hearings into the gun violence epidemic across the country and trying to figure out what can be done about that. But again, they're in a situation where Donald Trump's calling the tune, and what he wants is for them to try to dirty up Joe Biden so he doesn't look like he's the only thoroughly corrupt person running for president in 2024.
Let's go back to this Alvin Bragg case, the so-called hush money trial. It's the first criminal trial, it may be, of a former president. It's set to begin 36 days from now. Alvin Bragg has characterized this more recently as an effort to interfere with the 2016 election. That's what I was talking about at the beginning of the show. I think that's the important part about it, because the hush money part of it is an element of the election interference. You have spent a lot of time, maybe more than most, thinking about election interference in your roles both as an impeachment manager and on the January 6th committee. Tell me about how we and the viewing public and the American citizenry should be thinking about Alvin Bragg's case and the connection to the larger issue of Donald Trump.
Well, I think of it as Donald Trump never accepting Joe Biden's election. in 2020. And we know he didn't accept it, and he was trying to condition his followers not to accept it even before the election took place, going around the country saying the only way he can win is if there's fraud, and preparing people for what he knew from the polls was a certainty, which was he was going to lose. And he lost to Joe Biden by more than 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, a margin that he had declared an absolute landslide when he won by the same number of electoral votes against Hillary Clinton in 2016. But we know that he levied a violent insurrection against the election. He tried to overturn it in the states at the Department of Justice. And then, of course, he finally tried to get his vice president, Mike Pence, to step outside of his constitutional role and just declare Trump the winner or kick the whole thing into a contingent election. But he never accepted Biden as president, and he's continued to rail about that, and now is going around the country saying he will pardon the January 6th insurrectionists who attacked our officers and so on. So his approach to elections is that he will do anything to concoct a story that he has won, and he will do anything to undermine the other side, other than just go out to the country and tell people what he wants to do. There is no public policy agenda. They don't even pretend that there's a public policy agenda at this point. And that's a pretty terrifying thing for democracy. One of the hallmarks of an authoritarian political party is that it does not accept the outcome of democratic elections that don't go their way. And so he substitutes for real democratic politics all of this soap opera fantasy world that he's created, and we get dragged into Trump fraudland.
Well, let's go a little farther with this whole idea that there's no domestic policy. You mentioned when talking about the Joe Biden and the Comer stuff that, you know, if they could just pivot away from that and talk about real things. Last week, they tried to make a pivot. The House Republicans managed to impeach the Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. And I don't know if you know anybody who knows why he was impeached for anything that resembles high crimes, misdemeanors, or bribery. Sounds like he's following government policy. Policy that Republicans in the House wanted to change, and they managed to get compromised with Democrats on changing. So even when they pivot away from nonsense, they pivot into other nonsense.
That's right. The Senate spent months negotiating a border compromise agreement, and they came up with it because Donald Trump dictated to Mike Johnson and the GOP that they should not accept aid going to Ukraine. We know that Vladimir Putin didn't want that, and aid to Israel and aid to the suffering people of Gaza, unless there were a border deal. So a border deal was arrived at. After agonizing compromise, they came back with it. Senator Langford, Senator McConnell say, here, we've got the deal. Everybody's ready to vote on it. But then, of course, the fourth branch of government and the fifth branch of government, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, said no, they don't want any kind of agreement or deal at all. So they exploded it and they blew it up. And so now we're back to, all of his performative nonsense and the circus antics of the GOP instead of us being able to focus on real policy. Meantime, the people of Ukraine are under the gun of Vladimir Putin's filthy, bloody invasion and the militarized drones and the attacks on the civilian population. There is more suffering in Gaza taking place. We haven't done anything about that. We haven't gotten aid to Israel. In other words, we haven't dealt with the whole package that President Biden sent several months ago because they simply have no program on the Republican side.
It's remarkable. Congressman, good to see you this morning. Thank you for joining us. The Democratic Representative Jamie Raskin.